In the mythology of modern air power, the F-117 was supposed to be the aircraft that changed the rules. It did not fly like a fighter, it did not look like a fighter, and it was never meant to win beauty contests in daylight. But at night, against a defended target, it carried an aura few combat aircraft have ever possessed. In Panama, then in the Gulf War, the Nighthawk became a symbol of technological supremacy. It slipped through radar screens, struck the center of enemy power, and returned wrapped in the language of inevitability. To many watching from the outside, it did not just appear stealthy, it appeared untouchable. Then came March 99 and, over Serbia, during NATO's air war against Yugoslavia, one of those black, angular aircraft fell out of the night. Not damaged in a crash, not lost to mechanical failure. Shot down. A stealth aircraft, brought down by a missile system whose basic design dated back to the 1960s. It was the only confirmed combat loss of a stealth aircraft, and it remains one of the most embarrassing and revealing moments in the history of modern air warfare, because the real story was never simply that the Serbs got lucky. Luck mattered. Of course it did. But so did discipline, tactical adaptation, flawed assumptions, predictable routines, and a dangerous misunderstanding of what stealth actually meant. And when the wreckage hit Serbian soil, the consequences did not end with a pilot in a field and a propaganda coup on television. The debris of that aircraft became a second story of its own, one that led through foreign intelligence channels, museum displays, diplomatic rumor, and enduring questions about what Russia and China may have learned from America's first operational stealth aircraft. This is the story of the F-17 that got shot down. By 1999, the F-117's reputation was already larger than the aircraft itself. Officially, the Nighthawk had never been marketed as invisible. The US Air Force called it low observable, not undetectable. But in public imagination, especially after Desert Storm, it had become something close to magic. The airplane seemed to prove that technology had solved one of air warfare's oldest problems, how to cross defended airspace and survive. But stealth was never magic. It was geometry, materials, heat management, mission planning, and a careful reduction of signatures. It made detection harder, not impossible. It reduced the enemy's window to see, track, and shoot. It did not eliminate that window entirely, and against an enemy forced to think carefully, adapt constantly, and fight for survival, even a narrow window could be enough. That enemy, in this case, was Serbia's air defense network during Operation Allied Force. NATO entered the campaign with overwhelming advantages in aircraft, electronic warfare, precision strike capability, and operational depth. Yugoslavia entered it under bombardment, with aging equipment, and every reason to expect destruction. Under those conditions, survival itself becomes a form of innovation. Serbian air defense crews knew that if they radiated too long, NATO would find them. If they stayed in one place, NATO would hit them. If they followed doctrine too rigidly, they would die according to the manual. So they adapted. Among the most important of those commanders was Zoltán Dani, leader of the 3rd Battery of the 250th Missile Brigade, operating the S-125 Never, known in NATO reporting as the SA-3. On paper, this was hardly the weapon you would choose to kill a stealth jet. It belonged to an older generation of Soviet surface-to-air missile systems, built for a different era and a different target set. Against a well-supported stealth aircraft, it should have been badly outclassed. But Dani and his crews were not thinking in peacetime categories. They moved often. They used radar sparingly in short bursts to avoid anti-radiation missiles. By later accounts, they sometimes exposed their emitters for only seconds at a time, then displaced before NATO could answer. It was defensive gunnery turned into a kind of guerrilla air defense. Later accounts describe modifications, improvisations, and a willingness to stretch their equipment beyond standard practice. Whether every later claim about technical modifications is fully accurate matters less than the border point. They were not waiting passively for NATO to demonstrate superiority. They were studying patterns, shrinking exposure time, and hunting for one brief moment when a supposedly untouchable target would become visible enough to kill. And NATO gave them patterns to study. That is one of the hardest parts of this story for air power enthusiasts to accept, because it strips away the comforting drama of a one-in-a-million shot and replaces it with something more human, repetition. Later Air Force accounts and analyses of windows were watched, flight routes were estimated. Serbian forces, according to later reporting, may even have benefited from spotters near Aviano Air Base in Italy, where the F-117s were operating. If you know roughly when a stealth aircraft launches, and you know roughly where it must go, you do not need perfect information. You need a well-informed guess, disciplined timing, and a crew patient enough to wait. On the night of March 27, 1999, That guess paid off. The aircraft was flown by Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, call sign Vega 31. He had gone in alone, as F-117 pilots often did, trusting the aircraft's design and the larger architecture of NATO air power around him. The mission itself was not extraordinary by the standards of that war. That was part of the problem. Routine is comforting until the other side learns your routine too. Somewhere after the strike, on the return leg, the trap was waiting. Dani's battery had already tried to ambush F-117s before. This time, they were in position. Their radar emissions were brief. Their timing was controlled. The range was close, and according to one of the most repeated Serbian accounts, the critical moment came when the F-117 opened its bomb bay doors, exposing surfaces inside the aircraft that were far less stealthy than its carefully faceted outer skin. Whether that moment alone made the kill possible is still debated. What is not debated is that stealth has limits, and one of those limits is proximity. At a close enough distance, with the geometry working against you and the enemy prepared, the burn-through problem starts to favour the defender. The Serbs saw enough. 2 missiles were fired. In missile combat, a perfect centre hit is not always required. Fragments, shock and timing can be enough to cripple a stealth jet, turning a routine recovery into total loss of control in seconds. For Zelko, the shift from controlled mission profile to catastrophe was almost instantaneous. Warning indications appeared. Then violent motion. The aircraft pitched and rolled. Whatever illusion remained around the idea of an untouchable stealth platform ended in seconds inside that cockpit. This was no abstract lesson in radar theory now. This was an airplane dying under him in the dark. He ejected. Below him was Serbia, at war, under NATO bombing, and filled with people who would very much like to find the pilot who had just come down from the sky. As he descended, Belgrade glowed in the distance. On the ground, he hid, moved, waited, and tried to stay alive. At one point, he smeared dirt across his face, neck, and hands to reduce visibility. The world's most advanced strike aircraft had been reduced to smoking wreckage, and the survival of its pilot now depended on cold nerves, a radio, darkness, and the speed of a rescue force still far away. That rescue is an important part of the story, because it shows just how narrow the margin really was. The combat search and rescue effort that came for Vega 31 was not a clean Hollywood extraction. It was a tense, difficult, multi-aircraft operation launched into darkness, bad weather, and enemy territory. Helicopters and special tactics personnel came from Tuzla. The mission had to be reworked as better information came in. At one point, false reporting suggested Zelko might already have been captured. The rescue crews flew low, under clouds, using night vision, threading their way through poor visibility and danger so immediate that they nearly hit power lines in the dark. Serbian search forces were close enough to be seen on the roads near the pickup area. After more than 6 hours on the ground, Zelko was finally recovered. That part of the story usually gets told as proof of American professionalism under pressure, and fairly so. The rescue force did its job with extraordinary skill. But the rescue also underlined the scale of the failure that had made such a mission necessary. By the time Vega 31 was pulled out, Serbian state television had already begun turning the wreckage into spectacle. Civilians gathered around pieces of the aircraft. The image was unforgettable, not just a downed jet, but a downed stealth jet, exposed in mud and fire and daylight. And that image mattered far beyond Serbia. For the United States, it was a humiliation precisely because the larger campaign continued. NATO did not stop bombing. Stealth did not vanish from the battlespace. The F-117 was not suddenly useless. In a narrow military sense, the aircraft had still done what it had been sent to do many times before and would continue to do afterward. But psychologically, the spell was broken. A machine that had come to symbolize immunity had been forced back into the old reality of war, where no platform is sacred and no concept survives first contact unchanged. That is why the loss echoed so loudly. It challenged not the existence of stealth, but the mythology built around it. So what went wrong? The simplest answer is also the least satisfying. Nothing went wrong in isolation. It's the important lesson of all. An aircraft can be revolutionary and still be lost if its operational use becomes routine. If the enemy learns your habits, then your exquisite technology is no longer acting alone. It is dragging behind it a pattern, and patterns can be ambushed. In that sense, the F-117 was not defeated by obsolete hardware. It was defeated by obsolete confidence. Third, the defender adapted faster than the attacker expected. Dani's battery did not beat stealth in some grand technological sense. Serbia did not suddenly solve low observability. What the battery did was much narrower and much more impressive. It exploited a fleeting opportunity inside a compressed tactical window. It survived long enough to create an ambush, managed its emissions carefully enough to stay alive, and used old equipment intelligently enough to make one shot count. That distinction matters, because the loss of Vega 31 did not prove stealth was a fraud. It proved something more serious. It proved that stealth, like every military advantage, decays when it is treated as a permanent answer instead of a temporary edge. And then there was the wreckage. For Serbia, the debris was instantly political. It was proof that NATO could be hit. Proof that American technology could bleed. Pieces of the aircraft were displayed, photographed, and eventually preserved in Belgrade. The symbolism was obvious. The supposedly invisible attacker had become a public exhibit, but the geopolitical value of the wreckage went beyond propaganda. Almost immediately, rumors spread that foreign powers were examining what remained. Russian interest has long been widely reported, and Serbian museum officials later said that delegations from several countries, including Russia and China, had visited. The Chinese angle became especially persistent. In 2011, a former Croatian military chief told the Associated Press that intelligence reporting at the time indicated Chinese agents had moved through the crash region, buying pieces of the aircraft from local farmers. A senior Serbian official also confirmed to the BBC that some parts ended up in the hands of foreign military attaches. That is not the same thing as a complete transfer of secret technology. It does, however, suggest that at least some of the wreckage escaped tidy official control. What, exactly, could Russia or China have learned from those fragments? Probably less than popular legend claims, but more than Washington would have preferred. No one was going to build a modern stealth aircraft simply by collecting shards from a field. The F-117 itself was a product of 1970s design logic, limited computing power, and highly specialized mission assumptions. By 1999, it was already an old stealth aircraft, not a blueprint for the future. Defense officials later downplayed the idea that the debris offered a technological jackpot, but that should not be mistaken for meaninglessness. Even partial access to real low observable structures, coatings, edge treatments, fasteners, internal layouts, and thermal management choices could offer valuable insight, especially to states trying to understand how American stealth was executed in practice, rather than described in theory. Wreckage does not need to reveal every secret to be useful. It only needs to answer a few good questions. How were panels joined? Where were tolerances most exacting? What materials were used where heat and airflow mattered most? How much of stealth was coating, and how much was shaping? What looked elegant in photographs, and what looked improvised once broken open on the ground? Those are the kinds of questions engineers, intelligence officers, and rival air forces care about. Even here, though, caution matters. The strongest claims go too far. There is no clean, publicly proven line from the wreckage at Bunanovci to the shape of the J-20 or the future of Russian stealth programs. That makes for satisfying internet mythology, but bad history. What can be said with confidence is narrower and still significant. The shootdown gave America's rivals access, or potential access, to physical evidence of a real US stealth aircraft, and they would have been foolish not to study whatever they could get. In the years after the war, one of the strangest and most human chapters of this story emerged. Dale Zelko and Zoltán Dani eventually met in peace. The pilot and the man who shot him down became, improbably, friends. It is the kind of ending history sometimes allows when the shooting stops, and memory softens just enough for curiosity to replace hatred. Zelko later said that even while falling into the dark, he had respected the man on the other end of the missile shot. Dani, for his part, remembered the kill like scoring the winning goal in a football match. Both men, in very different ways, understood what had happened that night, not the collapse of one civilization before another, but a brief contest of skill, fear, discipline, and timing, and that may be the cleanest way to understand the meaning of the downed F-117. The Serbs did not destroy stealth, they destroyed a myth. They showed that low observability could be countered by patience, planning, and tactical intelligence. They showed that a technologically inferior defender could still create a lethal moment if the attacker became predictable. And they reminded every air force that doctrine hardens into vulnerability the moment it stops adapting. The Nighthawk remained historically important after Serbia. Stealth remains central to the future of American air power. But after March 1999, nobody serious could confuse stealth with invisibility again. That is why this shootdown still matters. Not because one F-117 fell, but because when it fell, it exposed everything attached to it. The limits of technology, the danger of routine, the resilience of an outmatched defender, and the global value of even broken pieces of advanced military hardware. On that night over Serbia, the only confirmed stealth combat loss in history was not just an aircraft being hit. It was a warning.